Hello. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, guys. Welcome to Fine Print, where we take a look at a poem that you have published and we just analyze it. We just kind of read what you have and see what's going on with the speaker, the structure, the turn, things related to poetry and poems to kind of get an idea of what you got going on. My name is Jeff. I'm going to be your guide. And you may be like, weren't you just here? Yes, but we had some audio issues. So we're going to redo this and kind of just highlight some of the things that stood out to us. I'll also include a link to the previous stream in case you don't mind a little bit of audio issues and some beeping. But hopefully this stream will be a lot smoother. So I'm going to share our poem so that way you can see the piece we're going to be taking a look at. And again, I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the things that we discussed in that previous stream. But this poem is called The Money Monster, written by Courtney Martin. I want to again give them a shout out. Congratulations again on the work published. That's great. Also, thanks to Orato or Orado, however they pronounce it, magazine. Great to become familiar with your work too. So let's get started. I'm just going to read the poem, starting from the top. Title: The Money Monster. The Money Monster is back again, rasping against my ear, stoking up my fear, bids me disappear. The money monster clings to me, breathing down my nape, bending out of shape, taunts me, no escape. I buried it with spade in hope it found me, decked with blade and rope, a reach which gropes beyond the scope of mere mortal's resistance. I'm offered no assistance. The money monster has its way with bones of one who could not pay. And again, this is the poem The Money Monster. One of the things that I think is always helpful at the start of a poem is just to kind of look at it from a distance. I'm going to zoom us out even further just to kind of just get that general impression. What are some things that you notice here? I think the thing that immediately kind of jumps out is this penultimate, third to last stanza, and just how long it is and how much bigger it is than the other stanzas. You may also note that the last stanza is also noticeably shorter than everything that comes around it, not just in terms of size, but also in terms of line length. You'll also see that in general stanzas, speaking of line length, are about the same. So we have five, and then a five, and then a five, and then a four, which we can explore. What could that potentially mean for us? But let's look a little deeper, zooming in a bit. Starting with the title, just kind of seeing what do you get from a title of a poem called The Money Monster. Some things that stand out to me, the adding some specificity. It's always a fun word to say. So we're dealing with one monster. Also, it's something that's known, right? When you see the in front of something, it's familiar. So this is something that we can imagine the speaker has some awareness of already. It's also a monster has a name, and it's also singular. Okay, so maybe this is the only one. When we hear monster, we think something more negative or sinister. I feel money can also kind of engender those feelings too, but we'll see. But it seems like it's going to be an antagonistic relationship towards money, one that leads more negative. We'll see how true that is. So, just to kind of highlight some things that stood out to me from the previous reading is there are so many little ironies going on. I want to start off with the ironies involving the money monster himself. This is a character who is surrounded by things like capitalizations. The money monster is capitalized. The lines where money monster appears, the is also going to be capitalized. Okay, so we're dealing with something that's given a lot of authority and power and reverence and respect, even if it's something that's feared. We can see that happening again in the second stanza, and we also see that happening in the third stanza. So lots of capitalization going on, lots of reinforcement of the idea that this is a kind of powerful thing. We see the opposite happening for the speaker. It's that we have a speaker who is often lowercase, my ear, my fear, lowercases. We also see the I not appearing until towards basically the second half of the poem. In addition to that, we have a speaker who encounters a lack of agency. A lot of what's happening in the poem, these are things that are happening to the speaker. The rasping against my ear, that happens to the speaker. Stoking up my fear, the speaker doesn't stoke that. That's the other thing that's having an impact on the speaker's life. We see the speaker gets clung to in the second stanza where it says the money monster clings to me. The speaker feels the breathing happen on the neck. The bending on the shape is a little bit confusing to me. I don't entirely know what's getting bent out of shape, but we can imagine it's something related to the speaker. The taunting happens to the speaker where it says taunts me, no escape. The one time where the speaker has some agency is in the third stanza where the speaker says, I buried it, which we can imagine that it being the money monster. We're not entirely sure, but just based on context, it seems like it is the money monster. It's like I buried it with spade and hope. But then immediately after that happens, the speaker loses the agency again because the speaker gets found. And we see other sorts of distancing occurring. So, for instance, later on in that stanza, we hear mere mortals resistance, which we can imagine as being attributed to the speaker. And then in the very last stanza, there's no I, there's no me. It's just there's the bones of one who could not pay. So it's just kind of like this kind of third person reference to who we can imagine is the speaker. So just in terms of like the roles between the money monster and the speaker, there's kind of this like complex play with authority, with respect and reverence, formality, and lack of it. And those sorts of other sorts of similar ironies related to kind of formal versus informal, we see in the first stanza as well. So in general, we're kind of using some typical grammar features like rasping, stoking, ing forms. But then we get in the third line, we get against, which actually becomes just against, with the that first syllable just getting replaced with the apostrophe. So we're playing this kind of sometimes we're going to be formal, sometimes we're going to be informal language, which I think also speaks to some of those relationships that we saw with the money monster versus the speaker. Also, just the idea of like the money monster and also just money. Money is something that often acts as a determiner of class. And so you have your formal versus kind of informal, elevated, higher classes versus like lower classes. So I feel like you're kind of seeing some of these battles appear. We're also seeing so much of the control being passed on to the money monster, which again capitalized, but the money monster does a ton of actions, right? The rasping, the stoking. Speaking of formality, there's also this word bid, which not a super common phrase, but the line here is, the money monster bids me disappear. So we're attributing this kind of more formal, elevated language to the money monster, which I think is interesting. Also, this commanding, the only commands that happen in this poem are given by the money monster. The money monster says, bids me disappear. In the second stanza, we see a similar situation, me, and then no escape. So we're seeing these kind of power dynamics being really displayed here in the money monster, kind of just taking advantage of the speaker situation. The speaker is not really given a voice. Do we see the speaker? Speaker doesn't talk the entire poem. The entire poem's given from the perspective of the speaker, but the speaker doesn't actually utter a word, which again, I think speaks to power dynamics. All the actual vocalizations that occur are due to the money monster. Some other things that are also happening too. So we mentioned that there's a difference. We see that speaker has the one moment of agency with the burial, and in this sequence is really interesting because there, again, some more ironies. The speaker does the burial. I buried it with spade and hope. So the burial happening with spade, but then also hope. So we had this moment of kind of just like abstractness, right? We're very physical with the spade, and then suddenly we have hope. And to this point, we've been really concrete because the money monster is back again, rasping, stoking up fear, bidding an actual command like disappear, clinging to me. breathing down my nape. We have a lot of these kind of concrete images, and then we get hope, which is probably one of our most abstract terms in the poem. It's an emotion word, so we're kind of entering that state of the speaker. Um, but then what happens immediately after that? It found me, decked with blade and rope. So then we go immediately back to the concrete, and I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I had mentioned in the previous stream was that I think this also kind of points to things that happen with fear, because a lot of times when you're afraid, you become hyper aware of your environment. A lot of times, the abstract stuff, the emotional things, yeah, I mean, you have the adrenaline, but you're also paying so much attention to your surroundings. You're like, what was that? Or did you hear that noise? Like you're paying a lot of attention to the senses. And I think that having that first line, buried it with spade and hope, having the concrete with the abstract, and then the next line, it found me decked with blade and rope, to send us immediately back to the concrete, I think really kind of captures moments that happen with fear. We mentioned stylistically that fourth stanza is doing, or the third stanza is going to be doing a lot of things differently, which suggests that this is where the turn in the piece is occurring. We see longer line lengths. We see a speaker that again is actually able to have some agency of their own for a brief moment. And then we also have some of those movements. We have the introduction of the direct emotional word with hope. And then we also get some pretty strong distancing, because we see a reach which gropes beyond the scope. So we see a distancing a bit of the money monster, because it's not even directly applied to them. It's more implied, like a reach which gropes beyond the scope of mere mortals' resistance. So then we get a speaker who is also undergoing some distancing, but self-imposed distancing. This is the speaker's perspectives in the poem, and then they're referring to themselves as mere mortals' resistance, not even giving themselves a name. Also, I thought the line "I'm offered no assistance," I think that's really interesting too, in terms of establishing a dynamic of who is this money monster character. It seems like there's some vicious thing, but at the same time, even the idea of being able to say like, "Oh, I'm offered no assistance," it's not like the example I'd given before was that, like, you can imagine like a lion hunting down a zebra, and the zebra's not would probably even be thinking that the lion would even be considering assistance. So that line I think is really intriguing in terms of what are the expectations of the speaker versus this the money monster, and maybe even just the money monster lore. I think it adds some complexity to it. The last stanza, doing a lot of things differently, like we mentioned, shorter lines. It's also a shorter stanza with only 4 lines in total. In general, that's always, I think, an interesting thing when a poem ends with a stanza that just does so many things differently. And this one's doing a lot of things differently. The line lengths are noticeably shorter. Um, we get a lot more distancing again. Even the money monster gets distance, like has its way, um, and then the complete, almost removal of the speaker, with bones of one who could not pay. So the speaker is entirely distanced in that last stanza, something that we haven't seen in the rest of the poem. It feels like a conclusion, but it also kind of almost feels kind of like a rush. Like I do kind of wonder, did we just feel like we had to close the poem? Um, so stylistically, a lot of things that are different are happening in that endpoint. But in general, yeah, I really like I really enjoyed exploring this dynamic between the speaker and the money monster, the stylistic things that happen when the speaker's involved, the stylistic things that are happening when the money monster gets involved. We never really find out what the money monster does or what the money monster really wants, or even the relationship with money. It's kind of just implied by the monster's name, but there's also a chance that maybe it's not directly that. Um, so those are just some quick rapid fire thoughts on this poem. I again want to thank Chris, Courtney, Martin for letting us explore it. This again is the Money Monster, which you can find in Arato or Arato magazine. Thanks so much for letting us explore your work. And if you have a poem, so if you guys are watching this and you're like, oh yeah, I want to have my own poem explored. Right? I'm liking this. I want to see what can go on and things like that. We would love to take a look at your work. What you can do is if you find us on our main platform right now is Threads, but you can also find us at theversuspoetry.com. Send us a message or tag us in a post and say, hey, here's a link to a poem that I've had published. Can you check it out? And we would be more than happy to do that. I also encourage you, if you like audio and MP3 and things like that, you can also get a podcast version of this same episode if you go to versuspoetry.com/podcast. Thank you guys so much. Hope you have a good day, good night, good afternoon, and we'll see you next time on Fine Print.